Welcome back. You're watching To The Point. Although not as young as it used to be, 65% of the Indian population is still under the age of 35. But till 3 months ago, the Prime Minister of the country was 80, and LK Advani at 86 was keen to succeed him. Whilst there's nothing in the law to preclude such ambition, is it right for our rulers to be so much older than the rest of us? Janardan Dwivedi, Congress General Secretary, has now suggested that politicians should retire at 65 or 70. But is that acceptable in a country that venerates age over youth? My guests are Atishi Marlena from the Aam Aadmi Party, BJP spokesperson Shaina NC, Magsaysay Award winner and former Inspector General of Police Karan Thapar, and the highly reputed sociologist Ashish Nandi. Strangely, after setting the cat amongst the pigeons, no one from the Congress party was willing to join us. Shaina NC, Janardan Dwivedi, the Congress General Secretary, has said that politicians should retire from active politics after the age of 65 or 70. As a young politician, would you agree?
I'd have to agree, because otherwise I'd be waiting in the wings forever. I think that there is a saying which I always quote, that experience has no expiry date. However, only because of that, there is a lot of waiting for the young brigade. Whenever it is a question of fighting elections or being nominated, the standard excuse that he or she is so young, they have a long way ahead and they could be waiting. What I think is important to understand is that when you have such a young population, 65% below 35 years of age, the representation also has to match that. The representation should understand the issues of the youth, express the issues with the moving times, and at the same time, the guiding forces who are experienced could continue to mentor us. But I think at public life and politics, where the innings, so to speak, starts at a much later age, I would only appreciate that there is enough, opportunity to good talent and to young talent. And this is across the board in all political parties and all spectrums. Unfortunately, politics is such an elixir, and it keeps even the oldest so up and about that sometimes one wonders whether one needs to be in politics only to energize oneself.
Well, very well said. Atishi Marlena, I want to pick up on that point that Shaina NC made about representation. In a country of 1.2 billion people, where 65% are below the age of 35, is it not fitting that those who aspire to rule them should not be more than double the median age? Atishi Marlena? Oh, we seem to have lost it. Let me put that to you. Do you think it's fitting that people who aspire to rule a population where the median age is 35 should at the very least not be more than double that age?
Yes, that is true, but I think you will admit that ultimately they have to be thrown out by the electoral system. It's a bit like, I would say, jobs in the corporate sector. As long as you are giving profit, as long as you are seen as a very useful functionary of the system, like let's say for instance,
you're saying a very interesting thing. If the country carries on voting for 70 and 80-year-olds, there's nothing wrong in those 70 and 80-year-olds contesting elections. Don't you think there's a moral duty on people when they cross a certain age to say to themselves, I can't any longer at 75 represent a population where the majority is under 35?
The politicians are not known for their morals. Therefore, they are known for their political acuity or its absence.
So till the electorate stops voting for them, this age group have a right to stand?
Yes, they have a right to stand, but they often do yield ground because perhaps somebody from the family, much younger, is coming into the picture, or because
then they yield because they're yielding to their son and their daughter.
That's right. And then they also may be physically unable to carry on.
Let me put that in a different way to you, Kiran Bedi. Murli Manohar Joshi and LK Advani are in their 80s, but they're physically extremely fit and mentally they're perfectly alert. Why then should age be a bar when there's nothing wrong with them and people continue to vote for them and they win elections? So what would you say to that? Because that's the opposite of what I put in a moment ago to Shaina.
Karan, I think it depends on what the leader is looking for. After all, the country has a leader, and the leader has a right to choose his or her team. It depends on what the leader and what kind of a mix the leader is looking for. And the country, fortunately, is blessed with both. It's blessed with ideas coming from youth. It's blessed with energy coming from youth. But it's also blessed with experience coming from seniors who may be past 65, 70, 75. So I think it's the prerogative of the leader to choose what kind of energy mix is he leading. I would say, barring somebody just because somebody's got that high age but is physically and mentally very agile, then I think he's got something of both. He's got the energy, he's got the experience. After all, experience comes at a very heavy cost. Heavy cost. And as long as the mix is a balance of ideas and listening to each other, I think there is a benefit to the society as a whole. So I won't bar anybody for age, whether you're young, whether you're over a particular age.
Atishi Marlena, you're with us now. You've heard Mrs. Bedi talk about how this is a decision that must be left to leaders. Leaders of individual parties will decide what sort of mix they want. But let me put that leadership question in a slightly different way to you. Look at the difference in dynamism between Narendra Modi, who's 63, and Dr. Manmohan Singh, who was 81 by the time he stopped being Prime Minister. Doesn't that difference in dynamism between the two suggest that in fact age does make a big difference, both in terms of capacity and in terms of performance?
First of all, Karan, I'd like to say that I don't necessarily want to get into the specifics of why two specific people have been excluded by the current Prime Minister.
But
because I think that while age may be presented as
Forgive
a
me,
reason,
Atishi, I'm not getting into that either. I raised a different question with you, which is, doesn't age affect the dynamism and performance? And the example I gave you was, look how dynamic Mr. Modi is compared to Dr. Manmohan Singh, who was 81. Do you agree that age affects performance?
I think that dynamism may be a different quality altogether. There can be people who are 81 and extremely dynamic. But I think on the overall question about whether younger people should be given a preference in politics, yes, I think the time has come. How we think thinking about how we actually get younger people into politics. And I think that I would actually like to raise another question here, that while political parties like the BJP themselves are talking about getting youth into politics, what kind of youth are they getting into politics?
Well, that's a different issue.
Most of their younger generation.
I'm not making this party political, so I'm not going to let you continue down that line because that will deflect our discussion. This discussion is about a special subject, which is should people retire at 70? Let's stick to that. That's what you came to discuss, not the quality of people different parties are bringing in. Because that's a different issue. We'll never get to any consensus on that.
No, it's not just a question of quality. I think it's a question of dynastic politics. Because much of the youth that most political parties are actually bringing in are the sons, daughters-in-law of their political leaders. And I think that is a question that needs to be asked as well. That apart from the sons and daughters, what processes are we putting in place to get in newer youth?
Okay, let me put that to Atishi Marlena. Let me put that to Shaina NC. Shaina, you've heard this concern, in fact, from two people today. You've heard it a moment ago from Atishi, you heard it also earlier from Mr. Nandi, that in fact, when elder politicians do bow out, they do it only because their sons and daughters are taking their place, not otherwise. Absolutely. Is that another aspect of this problem?
Concede. Yes, I think it is, and I do concede to this opinion, because most politicians think that if they're elected representatives, the constituency becomes their fiefdom, and they feel that, it's only them or somebody from their family who should continue with that. However, I think that the process of democracy has changed post 2014, because we have seen candidates across the country who need not necessarily have any political allegiance to a particular leader, but who have been given an opportunity to fight, who have won. And in a country as diverse as India, you're bound to have diverse opinions even on their candidature. But I think the point, coming back to your focal point, of why is it that people post 70, 75 don't on their own say that now enough is enough and let's give way for the new. That is the point which each one has to personally introspect on. he or she as a leader has to decide that this is, like for example, Narendra Modi himself stating that I will not continue post 75. I think that, and being in power and saying it is highly commendable.
Okay.
The fact that BJP has taken few decisions, we may agree or not agree, but the point that we're thinking of a cut-off age limit of 75 is something which is absolutely commendable.
Okay.
Because as I said earlier,
I take your
experience
point.
otherwise will have no expiry date.
I take your point. You know, you've heard China say that these are individual decisions that people who are over 70, 75 need to take for themselves. But actually, it's more than just a decision that the individual takes. It's an attitude that our society or our culture has, which venerates the elderly and tends to diminish youth. Isn't that one of the factors that permits politicians in their 70s and 80s to continue as if experience is all that counts and age is not a factor? Whereas in contrast, you had a succession of presidents and prime ministers in America and Britain in their 40s and 50s.
Yes, that is very true, and that kind of consciousness has not grown in India as yet. Though I must say, there is one sign of hope, namely that politics is becoming more demystified. It is no longer carrying the burden of, say, past work for freedom struggle or a long history.
And so it's easier for young people to break in.
That's right, and then therefore it is partly a competition amongst ambitious professional politicians.
Mrs. Bedi, how does one change this attitude of our society or our culture of veneration for the elderly and, in relative terms, a certain amount of disregard, I won't say dismissiveness, but a certain amount of disregard for the young? We keep referring to people who are under 40 as bachchas, but they're not. I mean, people have become prime ministers of England, presidents of America at 40, 41, 42. With the accidental exception of Rajiv Gandhi, in special circumstances, that's inconceivable in India.
I think by encouraging forums of listening to each other, the youth listens to the experience and experience listens to the youth. I think we need to have listening forums where the two generations listen to each other and create a veneration for each other. Seniors value new ideas, technology, energy, enthusiasm, dynamism, innovation, while the youth values experience, which comes the hard way. I think we need to create forums where it's orderly listening to each other, and you need both. In governance, you need both. You need youth, but you also need experience, and experience of what works and what may not work. So I think we need to create listening forums for each other, which I don't see happening.
Can I stop you for a moment?
Where children
You're laying a lot of emphasis on experience. Tony Blair and David Cameron, when they became prime ministers at 42 and 43, had no experience of government. Leave aside anything else. Obama, when he became president of America, had no experience.
But their countries are different.
So
also.
why is experience such a premium? Kiran Bedi?
There's a cultural difference. There's a cultural difference between India and the US or the UK. So you've got to, here there is a natural veneration, but that doesn't mean submission. I'm not looking for submission to experience. I'm looking for valuing experience, using experience, or even rejecting experience. Okay. I'm looking for a listening middle path where both listen to each other and both respect each other so that the country is a larger gainer.
Okay, Artistry Marlene, I'm going to come back to that central core thought. Should we have a retirement age for politicians? After all, bureaucrats have a retirement age at 62. Many army officers, because they retired as majors and colonels, retired in their late 40s and early 50s. Why should politicians not have a retirement age, say 65 or 70, as Janardan Dwivedi was suggesting?
I don't think we need to have a retirement age. I think the more central question was the one you were asking before this. Why is it that we can't think of getting more youth into politics? Why is it that we consider them bachchas, quote unquote? I think that is the more important question that we need to answer, because it's not an either or situation that we have either younger people or older people. But how we get youth into politics, how do we channelize their energy? And I actually think that the Aam Aadmi Party has done something quite remarkable on this, because if you see the average age of our MLAs who got elected to the Delhi Assembly is probably in their mid-30s. These are all first-timers. These are people who have come out of their homes for the first time in a political movement and actually have become MLAs and are learning on the go. They are learning how is it that you govern, how do you work in a constituency. And I think this represents a very positive trend in Indian democracy, that you have first-timers who are not coming out of dynasties and who are extremely young.
So the
Some of our youngest MLA is 26 years old.
So the secret, if I understand you correctly, is that party leaderships, party parliamentary boards must deliberately choose young people.
Absolutely.
What about something else? You made this point, and I think I'm right in saying that in a sense it was made by Shaina NC as well, that young people better echo the mood, they better represent the sentiment of the country. But let me give you the example of Ronald Reagan. No president has done more to change the American economy than Ronald Reagan. But he became president 3 months short of 70, and he left office at 78. But he clearly represented the entrepreneurial dynamic instinct that brought America's economy to a fulfillment it hadn't had earlier. So is it not possible that a 78-year-old can actually catch the mood of the country?
Can do so, but it partly depends on what kind of person, what kind of political backing, what kind of control over the party system and the government you have. I mean, Dr. Manmohan Singh didn't look so dynamic and active, not I think because of his age, but because he basically saw himself as a technocrat. Because he didn't have political power, true political power, he didn't have a political base. To some extent, his dynamism was naturally controlled by the system. There was a kind of a limit on it, because that kind of a person is very difficult to be dynamic.
Mr. Bedi, let me go back and put this to you. You're talking about the need for a good blend and mixture of age and experience. But how much vision can a politician have at 70? How much capacity to change the system can he or she have at 70 when 3/4 of his or her life is behind him? You know, he may be healthy, but clearly he or she is slowing down in terms of vision, in terms of capacity to change things. At 70, sometimes you say the struggle isn't worth it because it's not in you.
Karan, no, it's difficult to generalize. It will vary from person to person. You cannot just generalize. You've got to pick and choose. That's where I said the leader must have a choice. He can look at those 70 pluses and see if there is a vision and dynamism and willing to take ideas and willing to drive the change. Why couldn't he be picked? But if he finds that he is fossilized and he's just hanging on and he is resistant to change, why should he pick it up? The leader must choose. Because after all, it is the leader who's accountable to the people. So I would put the onus on the leader. The leader must have choices. But just because somebody is 70 plus, dynamic, academic, brilliant, willing to drive the change, why should he be rejected just because somebody is plus 70? I would go individually and not generalize it.
No.
Okay, Shaina, let me put this to you. It's a slightly different note to question.
Yeah.
What do you make of the fact that Janardan Dwivedi set the cat amongst the pigeons with his suggestion that politicians retire at 65 or 70. Earlier, Jairam Ramesh had said much the same thing. But today, absolutely no one from the Congress party wants to participate in this discussion. Officially, they've told us, they are not talking on this subject. What do you make of that as a rival politician?
Maybe they've been pulled up by the leadership, or maybe the leadership is not very comfortable with independent views. However, I'm not in a position to comment on the Congress party. I would like to just take forward Kiranji's point, which is that yes, the party leadership is to decide what the mix of the so-called senior leaders should be vis-a-vis the young leadership in the party and opportunities in terms of giving tickets. But eventually, the decision is clearly that of the electorate to decide if they want to vote in somebody who is young and dynamic or somebody who is seasoned and experienced. So I think the end result is about every single party positioning who he or her thinks is best as a candidate, and for the electorate to decide who they think is going to lead them.
Okay, that's a very good point.
In Parliament or in the Assembly.
That's a very good point. Very quickly, Atishi Marlena, I know your experience in the Delhi state elections in December suggests that at least the Delhi electorate is perfectly happy to choose young Aam Aadmi Party MLAs in preference to older ones from other parties. But do you think nationwide India has accepted the idea that a 35 or 40-year-old can be Prime Minister of India? Or do we still believe that the first right is that of a 60 and 70-year-old? Do you think Indian people accept youth is better?
I think that one needs to have a dynamic leader whom people think can bring about a change in the system, rather than necessarily a factor of age. I think that if there is a leader whom people think can lead the country, can bring about positive change, then yes, I think people in the country would be ready to vote for a younger leader. In fact, I think I would like to put a question that we need to think about, that instead of a retirement age, shouldn't we actually be thinking of lowering the age for fighting elections from 25 to 21?
Okay,
and getting more youth into
that
politics.
May well be one way of
that
ensuring.
That is what we need to think about.
It may be one way of trying to ensure younger people participate, but the bar is surely the attitude of our culture and our society, which is ingrained in us.
Agreed.
That we venerate age. Do you think the Indian people are ready to accept a 40 or 45-year-old newcomer, inexperienced, who hasn't been in power, which is what Tony Blair was, which is what David Cameron was, which is what Obama was, rather than a 70-year-old who's been minister in 4 governments in the past? Which would they go for?
I don't think they will be as close to the young person as you perhaps think, because occasionally the Indian people seem to come out of their groove and opt for youth.
Very occasionally.
But we have not yet got that kind of a charismatic leader.
It's a chicken and egg situation you're suggesting. When we have a charismatic young leader, Indians will vote for him and not venerate age. But till we have that leader, they may continue with their cultural belief that age is somehow something to be cherished.
That's probably true.
So we need to wait for a young, dynamic 40-year-old who sweeps us off our feet. And where is he or she? That's the problem, isn't it? My thanks to you for coming to studio. My thanks also to Mrs. Bedi, Atishi Marlena and Shaina NC for joining me. And that's then the conclusion we've come to. Until we find a dynamic 40-year-old young leader, be he a man or a woman, to sweep us off our feet, we may continue to vote for the elders and end up with prime ministers who are into their 70s or 80s. That's something for us to ponder over. Have a wonderful weekend. Goodbye. Good night.